In the gleaming towers of Dubai's financial district, where egos soar as high as the skyscrapers, one man's arrogance was about to meet its match. What started as a casual bet between billionaires would spiral into something no amount of money could control. This is the story of how pride, vulnerability, and unexpected love collided in the most impossible way, and why sometimes the universe has its own plans for those who think they can play with hearts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower buzzed with the kind of energy that only came when serious money was being discussed. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Dubai's skyline, where construction cranes danced against the sunset like mechanical ballet dancers. Inside the executive conference room, 5 men in bespoke suits sat around a mahogany table that cost more than most people's annual salary. Khalil al-Rashid adjusted his platinum cufflinks and leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk playing across his lips. At 34, he was the youngest CEO in his family's conglomerate, having built his own tech empire that now rivaled companies twice its age. His success hadn't just earned him billions, it had earned him a reputation. Women fell at his feet like autumn leaves drawn to his sharp jawline, his perfectly styled black hair and the confidence that radiated from him like heat from desert sand. "Another successful quarter," announced Omar Khalil, sliding a tablet across the table. "The Jakarta project alone brought in 47 million. Khalil barely glanced at the numbers. Success had become routine, predictable even. He gazed out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance, feeling that familiar restlessness creeping in. When everything came easily, when every door opened before you even knocked, life began to lose its flavor. "Khalil, you look bored," laughed Samir, one of his oldest friends and business partners. "Most men would kill for your problems." "Most men don't have my problems," Khalil replied, his voice carrying that particular blend of charm and arrogance that had become his trademark. "When you can have anything you want, nothing feels worth wanting anymore." The other men chuckled, accustomed to their friends' philosophical moods. But Hassan, the eldest of the group and a man who'd built his fortune in real estate across 3 continents, raised an eyebrow. "Anything?" Hassan asked, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "That's quite a bold claim, even for you." Khalil's eyes sharpened. He'd known Hassan since university, and the older man rarely challenged him without reason. "Name it." "Love," Hassan said simply. "You can buy attention, you can buy companionship, you can even buy loyalty for a while. But love, real love, that's something money can't purchase." The room fell quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Khalil felt something stir within him. Not anger, but intrigue. It had been months since anyone had dared suggest there was something beyond his reach. "You think I can't make any woman fall in love with me?" Khalil asked, his voice deceptively casual. Hassan smiled, the expression of a man who just laid the perfect trap. "I think you've confused being desired with being loved. There's a difference." Samir sensed the tension and leaned forward, even the mediator. "Come on, Hassan. You know Khalil's track record. Remember Sophia from Milan? She was ready to leave her modeling career for him. And what about that actress from London? What was her name?" "Isabella. She practically proposed to him at the Cannes Film Festival." "Exactly my point," Hassan said calmly. "They were attracted to what he represents, not who he is. Strip away the penthouses, the private jets, the designer suits. Would any of them have looked twice at Khalil the man?" A flash of something, pride perhaps or wounded ego, crossed Khalil's features. He'd built his identity around being irresistible, around having the world at his fingertips. The suggestion that his success with women was merely transactional struck deeper than he cared to admit. "You want to make this interesting?" Khalil asked, his voice taking on the edge it carried during high-stakes negotiations. Hassan's smile widened. "I'm listening." "A bet, then. Give me any woman at all, and I'll prove you wrong. No mention of my wealth, no private jets, no expensive gifts, just me as I am, and I'll make her fall genuinely in love within 3 months. The other men exchanged glances. They'd seen Khalil in competitive mode before, but this felt different, more personal. "The stakes?" Hassan inquired. Khalil thought for a moment. "If I win, you transfer your shares in the marina development to me. If I lose—" He paused, the weight of potential failure settling over him like a shadow. "If I lose, I'll donate $50 million to your Women's Education Foundation. And I'll publicly admit that there are some things money can't buy." Hassan studied him carefully. $50 million was significant, even for men of their wealth. But more than that, Khalil was risking something he valued far more than money: his pride. "Deal," Hassan said, extending his hand. "But I choose the woman." They shook hands, and Khalil felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with a new challenge. Around the table, his friends wore expressions ranging from excitement to concern. "When do I meet her?" Khalil asked. "Tomorrow," Hassan replied. "But there are conditions. You can't investigate her background beforehand. No private detectives, no social media stalking, no asking mutual friends for information. You meet her knowing nothing except her name." Khalil nodded, confidence radiating from every pore. "Fine. What's her name?" Hassan smiled with the satisfaction of a chess master moving his queen into position. "Layla Mansouri. She works at the Dubai International Library. I suggest you develop a sudden interest in books." As the meeting concluded and the men prepared to leave, Khalil stood at the window watching the city lights blur into streams of gold and white. He felt more alive than he had in months. Finally, a challenge worthy of his attention. What he didn't know was that Hassan had chosen Layla not randomly, but with careful consideration. While Khalil had been building his empire of glass and steel, Layla had been building something far more valuable: a life of purpose, integrity, and genuine connection with the world around her. She was brilliant, beautiful, and completely immune to the kind of superficial charm that had opened every door in Khalil's life. The bet was made, the stakes were set, and tomorrow would mark the beginning of a game that would change both their lives forever. But as Khalil stood there, supremely confident in his abilities, he had no idea that he was about to meet the one woman who would teach him the difference between being desired and being truly seen. In the quiet of his penthouse that night, as he prepared for what he assumed would be another easy conquest, Khalil al-Rashid had no way of knowing that by tomorrow evening, everything he thought he knew about love, about himself, and about what truly mattered would begin to crumble. Like sand through his fingers, the game was about to begin, but the rules were about to change in ways none of them could imagine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Dubai International Library stood like a monument to knowledge in the heart of the city's cultural district. Its modern Islamic architecture, a stark contrast to the gleaming corporate towers that dominated the skyline. Unlike the cold steel and glass of the financial world, this building breathed with warmth, geometric patterns carved into cream-colored stone, fountains that whispered rather than roared, and gardens where jasmine and roses competed for attention. With the scent of old books drifting through open windows, Khalil had never set foot in a public library before. Private collections, yes. His penthouse boasted a library that most universities would envy, filled with first editions and rare manuscripts that his interior designer had carefully curated for their aesthetic appeal rather than their content. But this place, with its hushed conversations and the gentle shuffle of pages turning, felt like entering a different world entirely. He adjusted his navy blazer, designer but understated, part of his new strategy, and approached the information desk. The morning sun streamed through the library's distinctive mashrabia screens, casting intricate shadows that danced across the marble floor like calligraphy written in light. "I'm looking for someone who can help me with research," he said to the elderly man behind the desk, whose name tag read Ahmad, academic research on Middle Eastern economic development. Ahmad's weathered face lit up with the expression of someone who lived for such requests. "Ah, you'll want to speak with Ms. Mansouri. She's our head of research and cultural studies. Brilliant woman, speaks 6 languages and has a PhD from Cambridge. She's probably in the rare book section right now." Khalil felt a familiar surge of confidence. Academic types were usually impressed by successful businessmen, and he had plenty of stories about international expansion and economic growth. This would be easier than he'd anticipated. Following Ahmad's directions, Khalil made his way through corridors lined with volumes in Arabic, English, French, and languages he couldn't identify. The deeper he ventured into the library, the more he felt like an intruder in a sacred space. Here, status was measured not in net worth, but in the depth of one's understanding, in the ability to connect ideas across centuries and cultures. He found her in a quiet alcove surrounded by ancient texts, their leather bindings cracked with age and wisdom. Layla Mansouri sat with perfect posture, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon that revealed the graceful curve of her neck. She wore a simple cream-colored blouse and navy trousers, professional but unpretentious. What struck him immediately wasn't her undeniable beauty, but her complete absorption in her work. She held a 15th-century manuscript with the reverence most people reserved for newborn children, her fingers tracing the ancient Arabic script as if reading poetry. For a moment, Khalil hesitated. There was something about her concentration, her obvious passion for her work, that made him feel suddenly intrusive. He was accustomed to women who noticed him the moment he entered a room. His presence was usually magnetic, commanding attention without effort. But Layla remained focused on her manuscript, utterly unaware of the man who had stopped in the doorway. "Excuse me," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Ms. Mansouri." She looked up and Khalil felt something unexpected, a moment of genuine nervousness. Her eyes were the color of desert honey, intelligent and searching, framed by long lashes that needed no enhancement. When she smiled, it was warm but professional, the expression of someone accustomed to helping visitors without fuss or fanfare. "Yes, how can I help you?" Her voice carried the faint accent of someone educated abroad, but deeply rooted in her heritage. "I was told you might be able to assist with some research I'm conducting," Khalil began, employing the charm that had never failed him. "I'm looking into the economic development patterns of the Gulf states over the past 50 years. Layla set down her manuscript carefully, giving him her full attention. "That's quite a broad topic. Are you focusing on any particular aspect? Oil economics, diversification strategies, the impact of foreign investment?" Her questions were sharp, informed, challenging in a way that caught him off guard. Most people simply nodded along when he spoke about business, impressed by his authority regardless of the specifics. "All of the above, really," he said, scrambling slightly to match her level of specificity. "I'm particularly interested in how traditional cultural values have influenced modern economic policies." A spark of interest flickered in her eyes. "Fascinating. That's actually one of my areas of specialization, the intersection of cultural preservation and economic modernization in the Arab world." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit. I'd be happy to discuss some resources that might be helpful." As Khalil settled into the chair, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. Usually, his conversations with women followed a predictable pattern: initial attraction, subtle displays of wealth and power, gradual seduction through carefully orchestrated experiences. But here, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, his usual tactics felt not just inappropriate but almost crude. "I should mention," Layla continued, pulling out a notepad, "that this kind of research requires significant time and dedication. The sources are complex, often contradictory, and require careful analysis to avoid oversimplification. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" The question stung, though he couldn't quite say why. "Of course," he replied, perhaps too quickly. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't serious about this." "Good." She made a note on her pad. "Then let's start with the fundamentals. What's your background in Middle Eastern studies?" Khalil felt heat rise in his cheeks. His MBA from Wharton, his success in international markets, his frequent travel throughout the region, none of it seemed adequate preparation for this conversation. "I have practical experience in the region's business environment," he said, carefully. "But I'll admit my academic background in cultural studies is limited." Rather than looking disappointed, Layla seemed pleased by his honesty. "That's actually refreshing. Too many people assume business success translates automatically to cultural understanding. The fact that you recognize the gap shows wisdom." For the next hour, Layla guided him through a maze of historical texts, economic analyses, and cultural studies that left his head spinning. She spoke with passionate precision about the delicate balance between preserving cultural identity and embracing economic progress, about the unintended consequences of rapid development, about the voices often overlooked in discussions of regional transformation. "You see," she said, opening a book to a page filled with photographs of traditional markets giving way to modern shopping centers, "the human cost of progress is rarely calculated in our economic models. When we measure GDP growth, we don't account for the loss of community structures, the displacement of traditional craftsmen, the erosion of cultural practices that took centuries to develop." Khalil found himself genuinely engaged, not just with her words, but with the way her entire being seemed to light up when discussing these ideas. She gestured as she spoke, her hands painting invisible pictures in the air, her voice taking on different tones as she quoted various scholars and economists. "Have you seen this personally?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "The human cost you're describing?" Layla's expression grew more serious. "My family is from a small village outside Ras Al Khaimah. When I was a child, it was a fishing community that had existed for generations. The men went out in traditional shows, the women made the most beautiful pottery you've ever seen, and everyone knew everyone else's story. Then developers came with plans for a luxury resort. The village was relocated." She said the last word with a slight pause that spoke volumes about what relocation had really meant for her family and their neighbors. "The new jobs paid better," she continued, "but they required skills my grandmother didn't have, languages my uncle couldn't speak. Progress happened, but at a cost that never appeared in any economic report." Khalil felt something shift inside him. He'd been part of countless development projects and had celebrated the transformation of traditional communities into modern economic centers. But he'd never considered the perspective Layla was sharing, never thought about the grandmother left behind or the uncle who couldn't adapt. "Is that why you became a researcher?" he asked. "Partly, I wanted to ensure that when we tell the story of our region's development, we tell the whole story. Not just the success metrics, but the human narrative. The voices that usually get overlooked deserve to be preserved." As their conversation wound down, Layla handed him a carefully compiled list of books and articles. "Start with these," she said. "They'll give you a foundation. But remember, this isn't just about reading facts and figures. To really understand the intersection of culture and economics, you need to listen to people's stories." Khalil took the Gishu list, noting that her handwriting was as elegant as everything else about her. "Thank you. This is more comprehensive than I expected." "Knowledge usually is," she replied with a smile that seemed to see right through him. "Will you be conducting interviews as part of your research?" "I hadn't considered that," he admitted. "I should. Data tells you what happened, but stories tell you why it mattered." She gathered her materials, preparing to return to her work. "If you're serious about this research, I'd be happy to help you identify people to speak with. My family still has connections throughout the smaller communities." As she prepared to leave, Khalil realized he didn't want their conversation to end. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion over coffee sometime. I'd appreciate your insights as I work through these materials." Layla paused, considering. "The library has an excellent cafe. We could meet there once you've had a chance to read through some of the foundational texts, say next Thursday at 2. "That would be perfect," Khalil said, though something in her tone suggested this was purely professional courtesy rather than personal interest. After she left, Khalil sat alone in the alcove, surrounded by ancient books and the lingering scent of jasmine from her perfume. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely challenged, not in the way business rivals challenged him with competition and aggression, but in a way that demanded he grow, learn, become more than he currently was. Looking at the reading list in his hands, Khalil realized that his bet with Hassan had already changed course. What had started as a game of conquest was becoming something far more complex, a journey into worlds he'd never considered, guided by a woman who saw through facades to the truth beneath. As he left the library that day, Khalil couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one being studied, not the economic theories in the books she'd recommended. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't entirely sure he was prepared for what that examination might reveal. Khalil's penthouse had never felt so hollow. Standing in his temperature-controlled library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that cost more than most people's cars, he stared at the modest stack of books Layla had recommended. The contrast was jarring, his collection curated for appearance versus her selections, chosen for substance. He'd spent the past 4 days attempting to read through her list, and it was humbling in ways he hadn't anticipated. Every page revealed the depth of his ignorance about his own region's history, culture, and the human cost of the very progress he'd helped accelerate. The academic language was dense, the concepts complex, and for the first time since university, Khalil found himself genuinely struggling to understand material that wasn't related to profit margins or market projections. His assistant, Mariam, had noticed the change immediately. "Sir, you've declined 3 dinner invitations this week," she'd mentioned that morning, glancing at the books scattered across his usually pristine desk, including the Al Maktoum reception. Khalil had waved her off, too absorbed in a particularly challenging chapter about the sociological impact of urban development to care about networking events that had once seemed essential. The bet with Hassan was becoming secondary to something more pressing, the realization that Layla inhabited an intellectual world he'd never bothered to explore. Thursday arrived with the weight of an exam day. Khalil found himself changing clothes 3 times, rejecting his usual power suits in favor of more casual attire. He settled on dark jeans and a simple white shirt, expensive but understated. As his driver navigated the familiar streets toward the library, Khalil rehearsed conversations in his head, trying to anticipate the questions Layla might ask about his reading. The library cafe was a serene space tucked into the building's eastern wing, where traditional Arabic design met modern comfort. Low tables surrounded by comfortable cushions created intimate conversation nooks, while larger communal tables encouraged scholarly discourse. The walls displayed rotating exhibitions of local artists, and the air carried the competing aromas of cardamom coffee and fresh pastries. Layla was already there when he arrived, seated at a corner table with her own stack of materials. She wore a flowing emerald dress that complemented her olive complexion, and her hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders. Without the formal constraints of her work environment, she seemed more relaxed, though no less formidable. "You're precisely on time," she observed as he approached. "That's rare in my experience with researchers. They tend to lose track of time." "I'm not a typical researcher," Khalil replied, settling into the chair across from her. "No," she agreed, studying him with those penetrating, honey-colored eyes. "You're not. Which makes me curious about what's really behind this sudden interest in cultural economics." The directness of her question caught him off guard. He'd prepared to discuss the books, to demonstrate his newfound knowledge, but she was cutting straight to his motivations. "I realize I've been operating in a bubble," he said, choosing honesty over the charming deflections that usually served him well. Building businesses, making deals, but never really understanding the broader context. Of what I was doing, Layla ordered mint tea for both of them without asking his preference, a small presumption that somehow felt intimate rather than presumptuous. What triggered this realization? Khalil thought about Hassan's challenge, about the bet that had started this entire journey, but something stopped him from sharing that truth. A conversation with a friend made me realize how much I didn't know about my own region's development patterns. And you decided a few weeks of reading would fill that gap? Her tone wasn't mocking, but there was a gentle challenge in it that made him shift uncomfortably. I'm beginning to understand how naive that assumption was. For the first time since he'd met her, Layla smiled, not the professional courtesy she'd shown before, but something warmer, more genuine. That's actually a sophisticated realization. Most people never get past the assumption that intelligence in one area translates to understanding in all areas. The tea arrived, and Layla began their discussion by asking him about specific passages from the books she'd recommended. Her questions weren't designed to trip him up, but they revealed the depth of analysis she expected. She wanted to know, not just what he'd read, but what he thought about it, how it connected to larger patterns, what questions it raised for him. "The chapter on rural displacement particularly interested me," Khalil said, trying to engage with the material on her level. "The author mentions economic refugees within their own countries, people forced to abandon traditional livelihoods for jobs that don't match their skills or values." Yes, Dr. Alzara's work on internal migration is groundbreaking. "What did you think of her methodology?" Khalil felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd focused on the human stories in the chapter, moved by the individual accounts of families torn from their ancestral communities, but he hadn't paid attention to the researchers' approach to gathering that data. "I focused more on the personal narratives than the academic framework," he admitted. Rather than looking disappointed, Layla leaned forward with interest. "Tell me what moved you about those stories." For the next 20 minutes, Khalil found himself sharing reactions he hadn't expected to have. He talked about the fisherman who'd never learned to read but could predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, forced to take a job in a factory where his traditional knowledge was worthless. He described the pottery maker whose techniques had been passed down through 5 generations, now making souvenirs for tourists instead of functional art for her community. "You're connecting with the human dimension," Layla observed. "That's actually more important than understanding methodology at this stage. The academic framework serves the stories, not the other way around. But I feel like I'm missing crucial context," Khalil said. "Every chapter references theories and concepts I've never encountered. I'm reading with a dictionary and 3 different academic journals open on my tablet. Layla laughed, a sound like water over stones, natural and musical. Welcome to real learning. It's supposed to be difficult. If it were easy, everyone would be an expert. She pulled out a notebook and began sketching a diagram, her pen moving quickly across the page. Think of academic research like building a house. You started by trying to put on the roof the complex theories and advanced concepts, but you need to lay foundation stones first. Her diagram showed layers of understanding, from basic historical knowledge through cultural context to advanced theoretical frameworks. Most people in your position, successful business leaders, don't have the patience for foundation work. They want sophisticated conclusions without earning them. And what makes you think I'm different? The fact that you admitted ignorance instead of pretending to understand, she said simply. And the fact that you're here having this conversation instead of hiring someone to write a summary for you. Galil realized she was right. He could have easily commissioned a research team to provide him with all the information he needed. The thought had never even occurred to him. I have a proposal, Layla continued, closing her notebook. If you're genuinely committed to understanding this material, I could guide you through a more structured approach, not tutoring exactly, but academic mentoring. What would that involve? Meeting weekly to discuss readings, visiting some of the communities affected by development projects, conducting interviews with people who've experienced these changes firsthand. Real fieldwork, not just library research. The offer was exactly what Khalil needed, but something in her tone suggested conditions. What's the catch? No catch, but full disclosure. This would be genuine academic work. I'd expect the same standard I'd require from a graduate student. That means being challenged, being wrong sometimes, having your assumptions questioned. Are you prepared for that? Khalil thought about his usual world, where being wrong was a luxury he couldn't afford, where every decision had to project confidence, even when uncertainty lurked beneath. The prospect of being a student again, of admitting ignorance and accepting correction, was both terrifying and oddly liberating. Yes, he said, I'm prepared for that. Layla studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Then we'll start with oral history. I'm arranging interviews with 3 families who were relocated during the development of the Dubai Marina 20 years ago. You'll help me conduct the interviews and analyze their experiences. When? This Saturday. We'll drive to the communities where they were resettled. Be prepared for a long day and wear clothes you don't mind getting dusty. As they prepared to leave, Khalil found himself reluctant to end the conversation, not because he was pursuing her romantically, though he couldn't deny her intelligence was deeply attractive, but because she'd introduced him to a version of himself he'd never encountered. The student, the seeker, the person humble enough to learn. Layla, he said as they gathered their materials, can I ask you something personal? She nodded cautiously. What made you trust me enough to offer this mentoring? You barely know me. She considered the question seriously, as she seemed to consider everything. Honestly, most people who approach me with research requests are either trying to confirm what they already believe or looking for ammunition to support predetermined positions. You seem genuinely open to having your mind changed. That's rare enough to be worth encouraging. As Khalil drove home that evening, he realized the bet with Hassan had become irrelevant. Somewhere between struggling through academic texts and being challenged by a woman who valued substance over charm, his original objective had shifted. He was no longer trying to make Layla fall in love with him. He was trying to become someone worthy of her respect. The irony wasn't lost on him. In attempting to prove he could win any woman's heart, he'd encountered the one woman who demanded he first discover his own mind. And for the first time in his adult life, Khalil al-Rashid was looking forward to being proven wrong. Saturday morning arrived with the harsh clarity of desert light. Khalil stood in his walk-in closet, staring. At clothes he'd never considered before, practical items purchased years ago for a corporate retreat that had been cancelled. Faded jeans, a cotton shirt that had never left its hanger, sturdy shoes meant for walking rather than impressing. The transformation felt symbolic, like shedding a skin he'd worn for so long he'd forgotten what lay beneath. His driver, Mohammed, raised an eyebrow when Khalil emerged from the building, dressed like any other weekend traveler rather than a billionaire CEO. "Different car today, sir?" Mohammed asked, gesturing toward the modest Toyota sedan Khalil had requested instead of his usual luxury fleet. "Different day," Khalil replied simply. The drive to meet Layla took them through parts of Dubai he rarely saw. Not the gleaming corridors of new development, but the working neighborhoods where the city's essential labor lived. Construction workers heading to job sites, domestic workers waiting for buses, children playing in small parks squeezed between residential buildings. The Dubai that made the luxury possible, but rarely shared in its rewards. Layla was waiting. Outside a small mosque in the Al-Qusais area, her hair covered with a light blue hijab that somehow made her eyes even more striking. She wore practical clothes similar to his. Dark jeans, a long-sleeved tunic, comfortable shoes. But where he felt like he was wearing a costume, she moved with the easy confidence of someone at home in any environment. "Ready for your first real research experience?" she asked as he approached. "I hope so," Khalil replied, surprised by his own nervousness. "Where exactly are we going?" "To listen," she said, shouldering a canvas bag filled with recording equipment and notebooks. The first family, the Rashids, were relocated from their coastal village to a housing development about 40 minutes from here. They used to be fishermen, 5 generations of them. Now they work in construction and security. As they drove deeper into the Emirates' interior, the landscape shifted from urban density to sprawling planned communities that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Cookie-cutter villas in beige and cream, wide streets lined with young palm trees still held upright by stakes, playgrounds where the equipment looked too new to have seen much use. "Tell me what you see," Layla said as they navigated the development's main thoroughfare. Khalil looked around, trying to apply the analytical skills he'd been developing. "It's well planned, certainly. Clean infrastructure, adequate services. But he paused, searching for the right words. It feels temporary somehow, like it was built for people to live in, but not to belong to." Layla nodded approvingly. "Good observation. Now tell me why that might matter." Before he could answer, they arrived at a villa indistinguishable from hundreds of others, same architectural style, same small front garden, same white fence. But the moment they stepped through the gate, Khalil sensed something different. Wind chimes made from seashells hung from the covered porch. A small fountain, clearly handmade, bubbled quietly in one corner. Fishing nets, too beautiful to be merely functional, were draped artistically across one wall. An elderly man emerged from the house, his face weathered by decades of sun and salt air, but his posture straight and dignified. This was Salim Rashid, and the moment he smiled in greeting, Khalil felt transported to a world he'd never known existed. "Ahlan wa sahlan," Salim said, welcoming them with the formal courtesy of traditional hospitality. His wife, Fatima, appeared moments later, insisting they sit in the shade while she prepared tea and dates. For the first hour, Layla gently guided the conversation through the family's history. Salim spoke with the measured cadence of a natural storyteller, his hands painting pictures in the air as he described the village of his childhood. The rhythm of tides that governed daily life, the communal nature of fishing expeditions, the way families had interconnected across generations. "The sea was our calendar, our clock, our bank account," he explained, his eyes focusing on something beyond the suburban landscape. "We didn't need weather reports or economic forecasts. The water told us everything we needed to know." Khalil found himself leaning forward, genuinely captivated. This wasn't the abstract economic data he'd been reading about. This was lived experience, generational knowledge, a complete world view built around understanding natural patterns. "When did things change?" Layla asked, her recording device barely visible on the table between them. Salim's expression shifted subtly. "The developers came when my youngest son was still learning to mend nets. They explained how our village would become a luxury resort, how we would have better homes, better opportunities. They made it sound like a gift." Fatima returned with tea, and Khalil noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she poured. When she spoke, her voice carried a different weight than her husband's, less philosophical, more immediate. "They gave us money for our houses," she said quietly. "More money than we'd ever seen at one time, but they didn't account for what we lost." "What did you lose?" Khalil asked, surprised by the directness of his own question. Fatima looked at him, as if measuring his capacity to understand. "Our son Ahmed was the best navigator in 3 villages. He could read currents and wind patterns that GPS systems miss. Here he works security at a shopping mall because that traditional knowledge has no market value." The weight of her words settled over the conversation like evening shadow. Khalil thought about the countless development projects he'd been involved in, the communities that had been relocated or transformed to make way for progress. He'd always seen these as win-win scenarios, economic growth that benefited everyone involved. The human accounting had never entered his calculations. Salim continued their story, describing the practical challenges of their relocation, learning to navigate bureaucratic systems they'd never encountered, acquiring job skills that had no connection to their life experience, raising children who would grow up disconnected from their ancestral knowledge. "The house is better," he admitted with careful honesty. "Air conditioning, reliable electricity, water that comes from taps instead of wells. Our granddaughter has access to schools our generation never dreamed of." But what?" Layla prompted gently. "But she doesn't know how to read the sky for weather signs. She's never felt the pull of the tide in her bones. She's gaining a modern education while losing an ancient one, and I'm not sure we've calculated that trade-off correctly." As the afternoon wore on, other family members joined the conversation. Ahmed, the former navigator, spoke about the psychological adjustment of working indoors after a lifetime under open sky. His wife described the challenge of maintaining traditional cooking practices in a modern kitchen designed for different kinds of food preparation. Their teenage daughter talked about feeling caught between 2 worlds, expected to be grateful for opportunities her grandparents never had, while sensing that something essential had been lost in the transition. Khalil found himself asking questions that surprised him, not about economic outcomes or policy implications, but about personal experiences, emotional adjustments, the small daily details that rarely appeared in development reports. How did you learn to sleep without the sound of waves? What happened to the fishing boats left behind? Do you still dream about the old village? By late afternoon, when they prepared to leave, Khalil felt fundamentally changed by the conversation. The Rashids had shared their story with remarkable openness, treating him not as an outsider studying their situation, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding their experience. As they drove to meet the second family, Layla was unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke. "You asked good questions there, questions I wouldn't have expected from someone with your background." "What kind of questions were you expecting?" "The ones I usually get from policymakers and business leaders. Questions about adaptation rates, employment statistics, measurable outcomes. You asked about dreams and sounds and feelings." Khalil considered this. "The data is important, but it doesn't capture what actually happened to them, does it? The human dimension." "No, it doesn't. And most people in your position aren't interested in the parts that can't be quantified. They spent the rest of the day with two more families, each with their own variation of the same fundamental story. Traditional communities transformed by economic development, people navigating the complex terrain between progress and preservation. Each conversation added layers to Khalil's understanding, not just of development policies, but of the profound human courage required to rebuild an entire way of life. As evening approached and they drove back toward Dubai's gleaming skyline, Khalil found himself seeing the city differently. Every towering building, every luxury development, every symbol of progress now carried with it the invisible presence of the communities that had been transformed to make them possible. "Thank you," he said as they reached the outskirts of the city, "for today, for trusting me with their stories." Layla studied his profile in the fading light. "You're not what I expected when you first walked into the library." "What did you expect?" "Someone looking for academic credentials to support predetermined conclusions. Someone who would listen, politely but not really hear." She paused. "You heard them today, really heard them." As they drove through the night-lit streets toward their respective homes, Khalil realized that something irrevocable had happened during those hours of conversation. The bet with Hassan, his original motivation for approaching Layla, now seemed not just irrelevant, but almost insulting to the profound education he was receiving. He was no longer trying to win anything. He was simply trying to become someone worthy of the trust that families like the Rashids had placed in him by sharing their stories. And somehow, in that shift from conquest to learning, he was discovering not just how to see Layla differently, but how to see himself. The week following the fieldwork passed in a blur of sleepless nights and fevered writing. Khalil had turned his penthouse office into something resembling an academic war room. Whiteboards covered with notes, timelines mapping the family's experiences, and stacks of transcribed interviews that he read and reread, searching for patterns that might honor the complexity of what he'd witnessed. His transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. During a quarterly board meeting on Tuesday, his uncle Rashid had pulled him aside with concern written across his weathered features. "You look exhausted, nephew. Are you eating? Sleeping?" Rashid's voice carried the authority of someone who'd built the family empire from nothing and wasn't easily fooled by surface appearances. Khalil had tried to deflect with humor, just working on a research project. Nothing that affects the business, but Rashid's sharp eyes had studied him with the intensity of a man who'd spent decades reading people and situations. "Research into what? You've missed 3 networking events this month, turned down 2 profitable partnerships, and Mariam tells me you've cancelled every social engagement for the past 2 weeks." The conversation had been interrupted by other board members, but Khalil knew his uncle's questions would resurface. The old man had built his fortune on understanding when something fundamental was shifting, and Khalil's behavior was setting off alarms throughout their social circle. By Thursday evening, Khalil had filled 30 pages with analysis of the interviews, but something was missing. The academic frameworks Layla had taught him provided structure, but they couldn't capture the emotional weight of Salim's stories or the quiet dignity in Fatima's voice when she spoke about dreams deferred. He was scheduled to meet Layla the next day to discuss his findings, and he feared disappointing her with work that felt mechanically correct, but spiritually inadequate. His phone buzzed with a text from Hassan. "Haven't seen you lately. How's your research project going? Still confident about our little wager?" Khalil stared at the message for several minutes before deleting it without responding. The bet felt like a relic from another life, a shallow game played by someone he was no longer sure he recognized. Friday afternoon found him back in the library cafe, this time carrying a folder thick with his analysis and a head full of questions. He wasn't sure how to articulate. Layla arrived precisely on time, as always, but today she wore an expression of barely contained excitement. "I've been thinking about your questions since Saturday," she said without preamble, settling into her chair with an energy that made the space around her seem to vibrate. "Particularly what you asked Fatima about learning to sleep without ocean sounds." Khalil felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Was that too personal? I realized afterward that it might have been intrusive." "No, it was brilliant. Do you understand why?" He shook his head, genuinely uncertain, "because it revealed that you were thinking about the sensory disruption of displacement, not just the economic or social aspects. Most researchers focus on measurable adaptation indicators, employment rates, housing satisfaction, educational attainment, but you intuited something deeper." Layla pulled out her own notebook, pages filled with neat Arabic script interspersed with English annotations. "I've been developing a theory about embodied knowledge, the way traditional communities literally carry their cultural practices in their bodies, their senses, their physical relationship to the environment. Your question about sleep patterns touched on that." She spoke with the passion of someone who'd discovered a new constellation in a familiar sky, her hands moving as she explained concepts that bridged anthropology, psychology, and environmental studies. Khalil found himself caught up not just in her ideas, but in the way her mind worked, the rapid connections, the intuitive leaps that somehow landed on solid theoretical ground. "Show me what you've written," she said, and Khalil felt his stomach tighten with nervousness he hadn't experienced since university examinations. He handed over his analysis, watching her face as she read. Her expression remained neutral, but he noticed the way she made small marks in the margins, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow. The minutes stretched like hours. "This is good work," she said finally, and Khalil felt something in his chest loosen. "Your synthesis of the economic literature with the interview data shows real analytical thinking, but you're still writing like someone trying to prove they belong in an academic conversation rather than someone who has something unique to contribute." She looked up from the pages. "What did those conversations change for you personally?" The question caught him off guard. Academic papers weren't supposed to be personal, were they? "I mean," she continued, "you spent a day listening to people whose lives were fundamentally altered by development decisions. You've been involved in similar projects throughout your career. How has that realization affected you?" Khalil was quiet for a long moment, considering. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, more uncertain. "It's made me question whether I've been building things that last, or just things that profit," he said slowly. "Those families adapted to changes I helped create, but I never considered whether they should have had to adapt at all. And how does that feel?" "Complicated. Guilty, maybe, but also responsible in a way I've never felt before. Like I have an obligation to do something with this understanding." Layla leaned forward, her intensity focusing on him like sunlight through a lens. "That's the insight your paper is missing. Personal reckoning. Academic research isn't supposed to be objective in the way people think. It's supposed to be honestly subjective, transparently personal about its motivations and discoveries." She flipped to a fresh page in her notebook. "Tell me about a specific project you've worked on, something that involved community displacement or traditional industry disruption." Khalil thought about several possibilities before settling on one that had suddenly taken on new meaning. 3 years ago, we developed a luxury resort on the Fujairah coast. Beautiful property, sustainable design, created about 300 jobs. But the site had been a traditional fishing harbor for generations. What happened to the fishing community? They were relocated to a modern facility about 15 kilometers inland. Better infrastructure, refrigeration for their catch. efficient transport links to markets. He paused, remembering his pride in the project's comprehensive planning. We thought we'd improved their situation. And now? Now I wonder if we asked them what improvement meant to them, or if we just imposed our definition of progress. Khalil ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that would have horrified his image consultants. I wonder if anyone asked the children in that community if they wanted to grow up away from the sea their ancestors had fished for centuries. Layla was writing as he spoke, but her attention remained fixed on his face. What would you do differently? Now, I'd want to understand what they valued before deciding what to offer them. I'd want to know what couldn't be replaced before assuming everything could be improved. He looked out the cafe window, where late afternoon light painted the library's courtyard in gold and amber. I'd want to listen first, instead of planning. First. That's your real research finding, Layla said quietly. Not just the analysis of displacement patterns, but the recognition that development decisions require moral imagination, not just economic calculation. They spent the next 2 hours reworking his paper, transforming it from an academic exercise into something more honest and complex. Layla guided him through the process of integrating personal reflection with scholarly analysis, showing him how vulnerability could strengthen rather than weaken intellectual argument. As they worked, Khalil became aware of something shifting between them. The professional distance that had characterized their interactions was giving way to something more intimate. Not romantic exactly, but the intimacy of shared intellectual discovery, of two minds working in harmony toward understanding. I have something to tell you, Layla said as they prepared to leave. I've been asked to present at the International Conference on Sustainable Development next month in Geneva. I'd like to include some of your findings about the psychological dimensions of displacement. Khalil felt simultaneously honored and terrified. You want to present my work to an international academic audience? I want to present our collaborative findings, if you're willing to be listed as a co-researcher. The offer was more validation than any business success had ever provided, but it also carried weight that made him uncomfortably aware of how much he still didn't know. What would that involve? Continued fieldwork, more interviews, probably, a trip to observe some international case studies for comparison. It's a significant commitment, several months of intensive research. Khalil thought about his uncle's concerns, about the business obligations he'd been neglecting, about the social life he'd abandoned without realizing it. Then he thought about Salim Rashid's weathered hands, describing fishing techniques his grandson would never learn, about questions he was only beginning to understand how to ask. Yes, he said, I want to do the work. As they walked out of the library together, Layla stopped under the building's arched entrance. Can I ask you something that's been puzzling me? Of course. When you first approached me about research, I assumed you were looking for academic credentials to enhance your business reputation. But the depth of your engagement suggests something else entirely. What really brought you to this? Khalil stood in the fading daylight, aware that his answer would reveal more about himself than any interview or analysis he'd written. The truth about Hassan's bet felt not just irrelevant now, but almost insulting to the journey they'd shared. I think I needed to discover what I didn't know I was missing, he said finally. And I couldn't have done that without someone willing to teach me how to see differently. Layla studied his face in the warm evening light, and for a moment something passed between them that had nothing to do with academic collaboration and everything to do with recognition. Two people who had found in each other unexpected catalysts for becoming more than they'd been before. See you next week, she said, but her smile suggested she was already looking forward to discoveries they hadn't yet imagined. The crisis began on a Monday morning with a phone call that shattered the careful balance Khalil had constructed between his two worlds, He was reviewing interview transcripts in his office when Mariam burst in without her usual knock, her face pale with urgency. "Sir, your uncle is here with the entire board. Emergency meeting. They're waiting in the main conference room." Khalil's stomach dropped. Emergency board meetings meant either catastrophic losses or family intervention, and given his recent behavior, he suspected the latter. He grabbed his jacket and tried to shift mental gears from research analysis to corporate damage control, but the transition felt jarring, like switching between languages he was losing fluency in. The conference room buzzed with tension. 8 men in identical dark suits sat around the polished table, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed irritation. Uncle Rashid occupied the head chair, his weathered hands folded with the stillness that preceded storms. "Khalil," Rashid began without preamble, "we need to discuss your recent distraction." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Khalil took his usual seat, noting how the familiar space now felt foreign, its symbols of power and success seeming somehow smaller than they had weeks ago. "The Singapore expansion requires your immediate attention," continued his cousin Tariq, sliding a thick folder across the table. "The investors are asking questions about leadership commitment. Your absence from the preliminary meetings has been noted." Khalil opened the folder, scanning documents that should have excited him. Property acquisitions, market projections, profit margins that would cement their company's dominance in Southeast Asian luxury development. Instead, he found himself thinking about village fishermen and displaced communities, about the human cost hidden behind these gleaming financial projections. "There's also the matter of the Al Maktoum reception," added another board member. "Your failure to attend sent a message about our priorities that's reverberating through our social circles." For the next hour, Khalil endured a systematic dismantling of his recent choices. Missed opportunities, neglected relationships, abandoned traditions of presence and networking that had taken decades to establish. Each criticism was valid, each concern legitimate from their perspective. He was failing to be the man they needed him to be. "What exactly is this research project that's consuming all your attention?" Rashid asked finally, his tone suggesting he'd been saving this question for last. Khalil hesitated. How could he explain the depth of what he'd discovered? The way listening to displaced families had fundamentally altered his understanding of their business practices. How could he describe the intellectual partnership with Layla? The excitement of genuine learning, the sense of purpose he'd found in work that served something larger than profit margins. "I'm studying the social impact of development projects," he said carefully, "understanding how communities adapt to economic change." Silence filled the room like gathering storm clouds. "Academic research?" Tariq's voice carried disbelief. "You're neglecting real business for academic research?" "It's not neglect," Khalil replied, feeling defensive. "It's expansion, understanding the broader context of what we do." Rashid leaned forward, his eyes holding the weight of decades spent building the empire Khalil was now seemingly abandoning. "Son, I've watched you grow from a boy who played with toy buildings to a man who constructs real skylines. But this sudden interest in social theory concerns me. Are you having doubts about our work?" The question cut to the heart of Khalil's transformation. Was he having doubts? Every conversation with relocated families, every insight from Layla's research, every moment of genuine learning had revealed contradictions in the life he'd built. But doubts felt too simple a word for the complex reckoning taking place in his mind. "I'm having questions," he said finally, "about whether we're building things that serve communities or just ourselves." The room erupted in frustrated voices, concerns about his mental state, speculation about outside influences, demands for clarity about his commitment to family obligations. Through the chaos, Khalil caught fragments that stung. Identity crisis, academic seduction, abandoning. Responsibility. Uncle Rashid raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone unaccustomed to having his judgment questioned. I think you need time to remember who you are and what you owe this family, he said. I'm temporarily reassigning your active projects to Tariq. Take a month to resolve whatever internal conflict you're experiencing, then return ready to fulfill your obligations. The words hit like physical blows. Khalil had never been stripped of responsibilities, never had his competence questioned. So publicly, the humiliation was complete, but underneath it lay something more complex, a strange sense of relief that he wouldn't have to pretend enthusiasm for projects that now seemed hollow. As the meeting dispersed, Uncle Rashid lingered. "Walk with me," he said, and Khalil followed him to the private balcony overlooking Dubai's sprawling expanse. "Your father built the foundation of what we have today," Rashid said, his voice softer now, more personal. "When he died, you became the bridge between his vision and our future. I've watched you carry that responsibility with honor for 15 years. Khalil felt the familiar weight of family legacy, the invisible pressure that had shaped every major decision of his adult life. "But this woman you're working with," Rashid continued, "this academic pursuit, it's changing you in ways that concern me. You're questioning foundations that took generations to build. How did you know about Layla?" Rashid's smile held no warmth. "I know about everything that affects this family. Dr. Layla Mansouri, Cambridge PhD, specializes in cultural preservation and economic development. Brilliant woman, impeccable reputation, and completely wrong for someone in your position." The casual dismissal of Layla sparked something protective in Khalil. "Wrong how? She represents a worldview that sees profit as a problem, progress as violence, development as destruction. Those perspectives might make for interesting academic papers, but they're incompatible with building the kind of business empire your father envisioned." Khalil stared out at the city his family had helped create, its towers reaching toward the desert sky like monuments to ambition and will. For the first time, he saw it through Layla's eyes, beautiful but built on displaced communities, profitable but at human cost, progressive but perhaps not wise. "What if your father's vision was incomplete?" he asked quietly. Rashid's expression hardened. "Then you dishonor his memory by suggesting it." That evening, Khalil sat in his penthouse, officially suspended from the company he'd spent his adult life building. His phone buzzed with messages from business associates expressing concern, social invitations he no longer felt motivated to accept, opportunities that felt increasingly irrelevant to the person he was becoming. He picked up his phone to call Layla, then hesitated. How could he explain that his commitment to their research might cost him everything he'd worked for? How could he ask her to understand the choice between intellectual growth and family loyalty, between authentic purpose and inherited obligation? Instead, he found himself reviewing the transcripts from their recent interviews, searching for guidance, in the words of people who'd navigated their own impossible choices between preservation and progress. Salim Rashid's voice echoed from the pages. The hardest part wasn't losing the old life, it was learning to honor it while building something new. Around midnight, Khalil made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. He opened his laptop and began writing, not an academic analysis or a business proposal, but a letter. To himself, to his family, to Layla, to everyone he was disappointing by refusing to remain who they needed him to be. The words came slowly at first, then in a flood of honesty he'd never allowed himself before. He wrote about the weight of inherited expectations, about the discovery that intellectual passion could feel more meaningful than financial success, about the fear that choosing growth might mean losing everything familiar and secure. By dawn, he had filled 10 pages with truths he'd never articulated, questions he'd been afraid to ask, and the beginning of an understanding about what kind of man he wanted to become. The suspension from family business felt less like punishment and more like unexpected freedom, terrifying but essential space to discover whether he had the courage to honor both his heritage and his emerging convictions. His phone rang as the first light painted his windows gold. Layla's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in hours, Khalil smiled. "I know it's early," she said, "but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about our conversation yesterday, about the conference presentation. I have an idea that might change everything we're doing." Khalil looked out at the city waking up below him, at the world his family had shaped and the world he was learning to see differently. Whatever crisis he was facing with his uncle and the board, whatever price he might pay for choosing intellectual integrity over family expectations, he realized he was no longer afraid of the consequences. "Tell me," he said, and meant it completely. Layla's voice crackled with excitement through the phone, an energy that cut through Khalil's exhaustion like morning light through heavy curtains. "I've been contacted by the United Nations Development Program. They want to commission a comprehensive study on traditional knowledge preservation in rapid development contexts. It's exactly what we've been working toward." Khalil set down his coffee cup, sudden alertness replacing the fatigue that had weighed on him since yesterday's board meeting. "What kind of study?" "Multi-country, multi-year research project. Starting with the Gulf states, but expanding to include similar situations. In Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, they want to develop new frameworks for development that honor traditional knowledge systems instead of erasing them." The scope took his breath away. This wasn't academic theory anymore, it was policy work that could influence how development happened across the developing world. It was the kind of project that could justify every sacrifice he'd made, every family relationship he'd strained. "There's more," Layla continued. "They specifically mentioned wanting practitioners involved, not just academics, people who understand both traditional knowledge systems and modern development economics. They mentioned you by name, Khalil." He stood and walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city that had shaped him and that he'd helped shape in return. "They know about our collaboration?" "Word travels fast in development circles. Your insights about the psychological dimensions of displacement have been circulating among some very influential people." Her voice carried a note of pride that warmed him more than any business victory ever had. "This could be the most important work either of us ever does." As she outlined the project's details, field research across 4 continents, policy recommendations that could reach the highest levels of international development organizations, the chance to influence how progress was conceived and implemented, Khalil felt the familiar stirring of ambition. But this time, it wasn't about personal advancement or family legacy. It was about contributing to something larger than himself, something that honored both progress and preservation. "When would it start?" he asked. "Immediately. They want a preliminary team in Geneva next week to begin designing the research framework. If we accept, we'd be based there for 6 months, then traveling extensively for field work." Khalil closed his eyes, calculating the impossibility of what she was describing. 6 months away from Dubai, from his family's business, from every obligation that had defined his adult life. Yesterday's suspension from company responsibilities suddenly took on a different meaning. Not punishment, but inadvertent preparation for a choice he hadn't seen coming. "I need to tell you something," he said. the weight of yesterday's confrontation settling over their conversation like storm clouds. "There's been a development with my family's business," he explained the board meeting, his uncle's ultimatum. The month-long suspension that was meant to bring him back to his senses. As he spoke, he could hear the shift in Layla's breathing, the pause that suggested she was recalculating everything they'd built together. "I see," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "And what does that mean for our collaboration?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had directly addressed. Khalil realized that somewhere in the weeks of research and conversation, their professional partnership had become personal in ways that went beyond romance or attraction. They had become collaborators in the deepest sense, two minds working toward shared understanding, two people who had discovered they could accomplish together what neither could achieve alone. "It means I have a choice to make," he said, "and I need to make it knowing all the consequences." They agreed to meet that afternoon at a small cafe in Old Dubai, far from the glass towers and corporate surveillance of the business district. The location felt symbolic, among the traditional wind towers and narrow alleyways where the city's original character persisted despite decades of modernization. Khalil arrived first, choosing a corner table where they could speak privately. The cafe occupied the ground floor of a restored merchant's house, its thick walls and high ceilings offering refuge from both heat and observation. Traditional oud music played softly in the background, and the air carried the competing scents of cardamom coffee and frankincense from a nearby shop. When Layla entered, she wore an expression he hadn't seen before, professional composure masking deeper emotions he couldn't quite read. She settled across from him with the careful grace of someone navigating uncertain territory. "Before we discuss the UN project," she said without preamble, "I need to understand something. What exactly is your family's objection to our work together?" Khalil had anticipated this question, but still struggled with how to answer honestly without revealing the depth of his uncle's investigation into her background. "They see academic research as a distraction from business responsibilities," he said carefully. "They're concerned that I'm questioning fundamental assumptions about development that our company's success depends on." Layla studied his face with the analytical intensity she usually reserved for research problems. "And are you questioning those assumptions?" "Yes," he said, the admission feeling both liberating and terrifying. "Completely." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "Then I need to be honest with you about something I've been avoiding." Khalil felt his pulse quicken, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything. "Between them, I know about your family's development projects," she said quietly. "The fishing village in Fujairah that became your luxury resort. That was my great-uncle's community. The families you interviewed last week were relocated because of developments your company initiated or financed." The words hit him like physical blows. The careful separation he'd maintained between his family's business practices and his research with Layla collapsed in an instant. She'd known all along who he was, what his company had done, the personal connection between his wealth and the displacement they'd been studying. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted to see if you'd reach the understanding on your own. If the work would change you without external pressure or guilt." Her eyes held steady on his, unwavering, in their honesty. "And because I needed to know if your transformation was genuine or just academic tourism. A wealthy man plays with social consciousness until it becomes inconvenient." Khalil felt exposed in ways that went far beyond professional. Embarrassment. Every conversation they'd shared, every insight he'd proudly offered, every moment of intellectual growth he'd experienced, all of it had taken place under her watchful evaluation. She'd been studying him as carefully as they'd studied the displaced communities. "And what's your conclusion?" he asked. Layla was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the same care she brought to academic analysis. "I think you've discovered something authentic about yourself," she said finally. "But I also think you're about to face a test that will determine whether that discovery becomes a permanent transformation or just a phase you went through." She pulled out her phone and showed him an email from the UN Development Program. "This project offer is real, and it's the opportunity of a lifetime for both of us, but it would require you to choose definitively between your family's expectations and the work we've been building together." Khalil read through the email's details. Research positions that would pay well, but nothing approaching his current wealth. Travel that would take them to some of the world's most challenging environments. Work that would put them in direct opposition to the kind of rapid development his family's company specialized in. "If I accept this," he said slowly, "I'm not just taking a leave of absence from the family business. I'm rejecting everything they've built, everything they expect me to inherit and continue." "Yes," Layla agreed. "And if you don't accept it, you're choosing to return to a life that you've already outgrown. Neither choice is easy." They sat in silence, while traditional music swirled around them and afternoon light slanted through latticed windows. Khalil thought about Uncle Rashid's disappointment, about generations of family legacy, about the security and status he'd be abandoning. Then he thought about Salim Rashid's weathered hands and lost knowledge, about communities displaced for luxury developments, about the possibility of work that honored both progress and preservation. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said finally. Layla nodded. "When you realized who I was, who my family was, what we'd done to your great-uncle's community, did you hate me?" She considered the question seriously. "No, but I was angry and I was suspicious. Rich men who suddenly develop social consciousness often do so for selfish reasons: guilt, image management, romantic pursuit." She paused, allowing a small smile. "You surprised me by being genuinely willing to learn, to be wrong, to change. And now? Now I think you have the chance to become someone who uses his privilege and knowledge for genuine good instead of just personal advancement, but only if you're willing to risk everything you've been given to earn what you truly want." As the call to evening prayer echoed across the old city, Khalil felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow, he would need to give Layla an answer about the UN project. Tomorrow, he would need to choose between inherited obligation and discovered purpose, between family loyalty and intellectual integrity, between the man he'd always been and the man he was becoming. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Khalil al-Rashid knew exactly who he wanted to be, even if he wasn't yet sure he had the courage to become him. Khalil spent the night walking, through the gleaming corridors of downtown Dubai, past the fountains and luxury hotels where he'd once felt at home, through the older neighborhoods where traditional architecture persisted between modern developments, through the fish markets that reminded him of Salim Rashid's stories, the spice souks where traditional knowledge lived in the hands of vendors who could identify origins and quality by scent and touch alone. By dawn, his expensive shoes were dusty and his designer shirt wrinkled, but his mind had achieved a clarity that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. As the first light painted the city's towers gold and pink, Khalil found himself at the construction site of his family's newest development, a mixed-use complex that would bring luxury shopping and high-end residential living to a neighborhood that had housed working families for generations. He stood at the fence surrounding the construction zone, watching early shift workers arrive to continue building his family's vision of progress. These men came from the same communities he'd been studying with Layla, traditional fishing and trading families adapting to service economy jobs. carrying knowledge their children might never inherit, reshaping their lives around economic opportunities that offered survival but not necessarily meaning. His phone buzzed. A text from Uncle Rashid. Family breakfast at 8 a.m. We need to discuss your decision. Khalil looked at the message, then at the construction site, then at the city spreading out beneath the rising sun. For 34 years, family breakfast had meant accepting his place in a system he'd inherited rather than chosen. Today, it would mean something entirely different. The family compound occupied a walled estate in Emirates Hills, its traditional architecture and expansive gardens a testament to wealth deployed with taste and cultural awareness. Khalil had grown up among these fountains and courtyards, learning to navigate family hierarchies as complex as any corporate structure. Walking through the main gate this morning felt like returning to a place he'd once called home, but now recognized as a beautiful prison. Uncle Rashid waited in the majlis, the formal reception room where important family decisions had been made. For 3 generations, the older man wore a traditional dress, pristine white kandura and carefully arranged gutra, signaling that today's conversation would invoke cultural authority alongside economic power. "Sit," Rashid said, his voice carrying the weight of patriarchal command. "We need to resolve this crisis before it damages our family's reputation further." Khalil settled onto familiar cushions, noting how the room's traditional decorations, antique coffee pots, hand-woven carpets, calligraphy panels, suddenly seemed like museum pieces rather than living culture. Beautiful objects preserved behind glass, while the knowledge that created them slowly disappeared from the communities where his family built their developments. "I've received concerning information," Rashid continued, "about the extent of your involvement with Dr. Mansouri and her political activities." Political activities? Her research advocates for development policies that would severely constrain profitable construction in traditional communities. Her academic work directly opposes the kind of projects that built our family's wealth. Rashid's eyes held the calculating intensity Khalil remembered from childhood, when disobedience meant not just personal disappointment but family shame. "She's using you to access information about our business practices, Khalil. You're being manipulated by someone with an agenda that threatens everything we've built." The accusation hit with surgical precision, designed to exploit Khalil's deepest insecurities about his academic worthiness and professional judgment. For a moment, he felt the familiar urge to defend himself through submission, to accept his uncle's interpretation rather than trust his own experience. But then he thought about Layla's honesty the previous afternoon, her willingness to reveal, her family connection despite the risk it posed to their collaboration. He thought about the careful way she'd guided his learning without imposing conclusions, the respect she'd shown for his intellectual growth even when it challenged her own assumptions. "She told me about her family's connection to our Fujairah project," Khalil said quietly. "She revealed information that could have destroyed our working relationship because she valued honesty over advantage." Rashid's expression shifted. Surprise flickering across features trained to reveal nothing. He hadn't expected Khalil to know about Layla's personal stake in their research. "Then you understand why this collaboration is impossible," Rashid said, recovering quickly. "She has personal grievances against our family's business practices. Her academic research is compromised by emotional bias. Or maybe her emotional connection makes her research more honest than objective analysis ever could be," Khalil replied. "Maybe understanding the human cost of development requires listening to people who've actually paid that cost." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of fountains in the courtyard. 3 generations of family portraits looked down from the walls, men who'd built fortunes through shrewd analysis and calculated risks, who'd never allowed emotional considerations to compromise profitable decisions. "You're talking like her," Rashid said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "using her language, her perspectives, her values. Do you understand what you're abandoning?" Khalil looked around the majlis, at the symbols of wealth and status that had shaped his identity since childhood. "I understand what I'm choosing," he said, "and I understand what it costs." "The United Nations project," Rashid said, confirming that his information network extended far beyond family business concerns. 6 months in Geneva, then field research in developing countries, policy work that directly opposes profitable development practices. You'd be working against your own family's interests. I'd be working for something I believe in. Belief doesn't pay for the lifestyle you've enjoyed, or maintain the social position you've inherited, or honor the sacrifices your father made to build what you're now rejecting. The invocation of his father's memory was Rashid's final weapon, the appeal to generational obligation that had shaped every major decision of Khalil's adult life. He felt the familiar weight of inherited guilt, the sense that choosing his own path meant betraying everyone who'd sacrificed to make that choice possible. "My father built a successful business," Khalil said slowly, working through thoughts that had crystallized during his night of walking. "But he also taught me that real success requires serving something larger than yourself. Maybe honoring his memory means using what he gave me to build something better than what he could imagine." Rashid stood, his formal posture signaling that negotiation had ended and judgment was about to be pronounced. "If you accept this UN position, you're choosing to become an enemy of your own family's work. There won't be a place for you in our business when this academic adventure ends. There won't be financial support when idealism proves insufficient for practical living. You'll be cutting yourself off from everything that's protected and provided for you since birth." Khalil felt the finality of his uncle's words, the careful dismantling of every safety net that had allowed him to take risks throughout his life. The threat was clear and comprehensive. Choose the UN project and lose not just wealth but family. Connection, not just business position but cultural belonging. "I understand," Khalil said, standing to face his uncle across the room, where 3 generations of family decisions had been made. "And I accept those consequences." For a moment, neither man spoke. Outside, the call to prayer began from a nearby mosque, the ancient rhythm that had ordered daily life in this region for centuries, persisting through every change and development that had transformed the landscape around it. "Then you're no longer my nephew in any meaningful sense," Rashid said finally. "You're someone I once knew who chose to become a stranger." Khalil walked out of the family compound for what he knew would be the last time as a member in good standing. His phone contained 17 missed calls from business associates, 12 text messages from social contacts, and 1 email from Layla with the simple subject line, "Ready when you are." As he drove through the city his family had helped build, Khalil realized he was no longer looking at Dubai as home, but as a place he was preparing to leave. The towers and developments that had once seemed like monuments to vision and achievement now looked like symptoms of incomplete understanding, beautiful, but built on foundations of displaced knowledge and disrupted communities. He pulled over, at a park near the library where he'd first met Layla, finding a bench that offered a view of both the old city's wind towers and the new city's glass spires. Taking out his phone, he composed a message to the UN Development Program, accepting their research position. Then he sent a text to Layla, yes to Geneva, yes to the work, yes to whatever comes next. As he sat in the morning sun, officially severed from his family's empire and committed to an uncertain future built on principles rather than inheritance, Khalil felt something he'd never experienced before. The terrifying, exhilarating freedom of choosing his own definition of success, The bet with Hassan seemed like a memory from someone else's life, a game played by a man who'd measured worth in terms of conquest rather than contribution. What he'd found instead of winning Layla's love was something more valuable and more demanding. A partnership based on shared purpose, mutual respect, and the courage to build something meaningful from the ground up. His phone buzzed with Layla's response. "The work begins now. Thank you for choosing to become who you really are." Looking out at the city he was preparing to leave behind, Khalil smiled and began planning for the most important work of his life. 6 months later, Hassan al-Mansouri sat in his Geneva hotel suite, reading the morning news on his tablet when a familiar name caught his attention. The headline from the International Development Review read, "Groundbreaking UN Study Challenges, Traditional Development Models, Gulf Executive turned Researcher Leads Innovative Community Partnership Approach." The accompanying photograph showed Khalil al-Rashid standing beside a group of Maasai elders in Kenya, his expensive suits replaced by field clothes, his carefully styled hair disheveled by African wind, his expression holding a contentment Hassan had never seen during their years of friendship. Beside him stood Dr. Layla Mansouri, pointing to something in a research notebook, her face animated with the kind of passion that came from work that mattered. Hassan smiled and reached for his phone. The number he dialed hadn't been used in months, but Khalil answered on the second ring. "Hassan," Khalil's voice carried surprise, mixed with wariness. "I didn't expect to hear from you." "I'm reading about your UN research project," Hassan said, settling back in his chair. "Quite impressive coverage in the international development press." A pause. "Thank you. The work has been transformative, I can imagine. Tell me, do you remember our conversation 6 months ago about making any woman fall in love?" Hassan heard Khalil's quiet laugh, a sound that held more wisdom than bitterness. "I remember a different man making a foolish bet about something he didn't understand. And yet here you are, working closely with the woman I suggested you meet. Some might say you succeeded beyond your original goal." "No," Khalil said firmly. "I failed completely at what I set out to do, which turned out to be the most important failure of my life." Hassan walked to his window, looking out at Lake Geneva, where UN delegates from around the world gathered to shape policies that would affect millions of lives. "Explain." "I never made Layla fall in love with me," Khalil said. "Instead, she taught me how to fall in love with something larger than myself. The work we're doing, the communities we're learning from, the possibility of development that honors, rather than erases traditional knowledge. I couldn't have predicted any of it. And Dr. Mansouri, what is your relationship now?" Another pause, longer this time. "We're partners in the truest sense, not romantic partners, though there's deep affection and respect, but intellectual partners, collaborators, working towards something neither of us could achieve alone. It's more intimate than anything I experienced in my previous life, and more demanding." Hassan nodded, understanding more than Khalil realized. "So, you lost the bet?" "Completely. Which means I owe you $50 million and a public admission that some things can't be bought." "About that," Hassan said, his voice taking on the tone of someone about to reveal a carefully kept secret. "There's something I need to tell you about our wager." "Oh?" "Dr. Layla Mansouri is my niece." The silence on the line stretched so long that Hassan wondered if the call had been disconnected. "Your niece," Khalil finally said, his voice flat with disbelief. "My brother's daughter, brilliant woman, completely dedicated to her research and thoroughly immune to the kind of superficial charm that usually opens doors for men in your position." Hassan paused, allowing the implications to settle. "I knew exactly what would happen when you met her. You set me up. I educated you. just as she did, though through different methods. Hassan's voice carried the satisfaction of a chess master, revealing a strategy that had taken months to unfold. You see, Khalil, I'd been watching you for years. Brilliant businessman, natural, leader, but completely disconnected from the human impact of your decisions. You needed to discover what you were missing before you could become who you were capable of being. So the bet was never about making her fall in love with me. The bet was about whether you were capable of growth or just another wealthy man. Playing with lives for entertainment, Layla agreed to help me find out. Khalil processed this revelation, understanding that every aspect of his transformation had been guided by people who'd seen potential in him that he hadn't recognized in himself. She knew who I was from the beginning, about my family's connection to her great-uncle's village. Of course, but she also saw something in you that even I wasn't certain about, genuine intellectual curiosity and the courage to be wrong. She could have exposed your family's role in her community's displacement immediately, but she chose to see if you'd reach that understanding through your own moral development. And if I hadn't, then you would have remained exactly who you were, successful, wealthy, and ultimately empty. The research collaboration would have ended, you would have returned to your family business, and nothing would have changed. Hassan could hear the sound of voices in the background, Layla calling Khalil's name, something about a meeting with village leaders. I have to go, Khalil said. We're presenting our preliminary findings to a community council this afternoon. Before you do, let me ask you something. Knowing what you know now about the bet, about my manipulation, about Layla's initial deception, do you regret any of it? Khalil was quiet for a moment, considering. You gave me the chance to discover who I could become instead of just who I was expected to be. Layla challenged me to earn respect through learning rather than expecting it through wealth. Even the deception served a purpose. It forced me to be authentic because I didn't know I was being tested. And now I'm doing work that matters, with someone who sees me clearly and chooses to collaborate anyway. I've lost everything I inherited and gained everything I never knew I wanted. Khalil's voice carried a contentment Hassan had never heard before. So no, I don't regret any of it. Then perhaps you won our bet after all, just not in the way either of us expected. How so? You set out to make a woman fall in love with you through manipulation and charm. Instead, you became someone worthy of love through honesty and growth. That's a far more impressive victory. After ending the call, Hassan sat in his Geneva suite, thinking about the complexity of human development, personal and societal. Outside his window, delegates from around the world worked to address global challenges through policy and funding. But real change, he reflected, happened one person at a time, through the kind of individual transformation his nephew and Khalil had achieved together. 3 floors below, in the UN building's conference room, Khalil and Layla presented their research to an audience of development professionals who listened with the attention reserved for genuinely innovative ideas. Their work documented not just the economic impacts of traditional community displacement, but provided frameworks for development that preserved cultural knowledge while enabling economic growth. As Khalil spoke about lessons learned from fishing, communities in Fujairah and pastoralist societies in Kenya, he caught Layla's eye across the room. She smiled, not the professional courtesy of their early interactions, but the warm recognition of a true intellectual partner. The man who had once measured success through conquest had learned to find meaning in contribution. The woman who had once guarded her knowledge carefully had found someone worthy of sharing it with, and the bet that had started with arrogance had ended with wisdom none of them could have anticipated. In the end, Hassan had been right about one thing. Love couldn't be bought or manipulated into existence, But it could be earned through the patient work of becoming someone worthy of it, whether that love was romantic, familial, or the deep satisfaction that came from work that served something larger than oneself. The true wager, Khalil realized, had never been about making someone fall in love with him. It had been about whether he was brave enough to fall in love with the person he could become. And in that bet, against all odds and expectations, everyone had won. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.